Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the sixth paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The title is Modification in the Reality. And here we go. Modification in the reality. Thus, reasoning in the abstract, the mind cannot stop short of an extreme, because it has to deal with an extreme with a conflict of forces left to themselves, and obeying no other but their own inner laws. If we should seek to deduce from the pure conception of war an absolute point for the aim which we shall propose and for the means which we shall apply, this constant reciprocal action would involve us in extremes which would be nothing but a play of ideas produced by an almost invisible train of logical subtleties. If, adhering closely to the absolute, we try to avoid all difficulties by a stroke of the pen, and insist with logical strictness that in every case the extreme must be the object, and the utmost effort must be exerted in that direction, such a stroke of the pen would be a mere paper law, not by any means adapted to the real world. Even supposing this extreme tension of forces was an absolute which could easily be ascertained, still we must admit that the human mind would hardly submit itself to this kind of logical chimera. There would be in many cases an unnecessary waste of power, which would be in opposition to the other principles of statecraft. An effort of will would be required disproportioned to the proposed object, which therefore it would be impossible to realize, for the human will does not derive its impulse from logical subtleties. But everything takes a different shape when we pass from abstractions to reality. In the former, everything must be subject to optimism, and we must imagine the one side as well as the other striving after perfection and even attaining it. Will this ever take place in reality? If it will, first, war becomes a completely isolated act which arises suddenly, and is in no way connected with the previous history of the combatant states. Second, if it is limited to a single solution, or to several simultaneous solutions. Third, if it contains within itself the solution perfect and complete, free from any reaction upon it through a calculation beforehand of the political situation which will follow from it. So, this chapter is particularly interesting because von Clausewitz is fundamentally observing how the four stated principles involving the various reciprocal action which bring fundamentally at least tend to an extreme and are pretty much theoretical in nature, objectively are difficult to accept, to be fully achieved into reality, or better, to have a a full attainment into reality. This is particularly important because if you have followed the videos on at least the previous three paragraphs, but really from the very beginning, you have noticed that we have been stressing the constant existence of theory and practice. So von Clausewitz at this point is still very much talking in line of principle, in theory, and he is fundamentally stating how these main dynamics in war occur independently, fundamentally, from the external factors that can intervene into war. So in this paragraph, von Clausewitz is making a point saying how should really be war in reality if these principles would be fully attained, which is impossible, as he admits. So that's how it explains it. So the what he says, repeating fundamentally, thus reasoning in the abstract, the mind cannot stop short of an extreme, because it has to deal with an extreme with a conflict of forces left to themselves and obeying no other but their own inner laws. So if we were to consider history, in other words, we have to consider war, in other words, like just this abstract, at an abstract level, we would be polarized by these extremes from that we have observed in the three reciprocal actions, for which fundamentally the two fighters each one against the ultimate goal of war, that is to disarm the enemy, to compel him to your own will, and this is a pure theoretical thing, as if, these laws that we had, that von Clausewitz has just traced in the previous paragraphs, were fundamentally an absolute that you can find even in reality. But this is an abstraction, because fundamentally these extremes in reality are never reached, are never achieved. And this is important, saying, obeying no other but their own inner laws. Here, we're talking about the inner laws of war, conceiving war as essentially an element completely detached from any other external intervention. Then he says, if we should seek to deduce from the pure conception of war an absolute point for the aim which we shall propose and for the means which we shall apply, this constant reciprocal action would involve us in extremes which would be nothing but a play of ideas produced by an almost invisible train of logical subtleties. So this is the point. If we were, von Clausewitz is telling, if we were to take this, we keep polarized to these extremes and thinking they can be attained in reality, we would fundamentally just be playing with our own ideas. So we wouldn't observe anything really concrete. We can think that these laws really work in theory, but the practice never reaches to those extremes, and therefore if we really just think only in terms of those extremes, we lose practically the point in reality. So it would say, von Clausewitz says that this kind of reasoning would be just an almost invisible train of logical subtleties. Subtleties, sorry. I said subtleties, I'm sorry for the mispronunciation, but subtleties. So, then he goes on, if, adhering closely to the absolute, we try to avoid all difficulties by a stroke of the pen, and insist with logical strictness that in every case the extreme must be the object, and the utmost effort must be exerted in that direction, such a stroke of the pen would be a mere paper law, not by any means adapted to the real world. So this is a fantastic phrase. I don't think it requires much of an explanation, but anyhow, this is a very important concept, because it basically observes that war, this is implied in this statement, knowing Clausewitz in theory, the modality of the enactment of violence, let's say, are always controlled and modified by something. So, thinking that in war, fundamentally the object is always this utmost effort that we have seen in the third paragraph, the utmost use of force, and that in every situation which should tend, in every real situation which should tend to that extreme, we would fundamentally have no connection with reality. We would simply deny everything that, in fact, in reality happens to limit this utmost effort towards the extreme. It's very beautiful how von Clausewitz uses the term, to get rid, here how it is, to avoid all difficulties by a stroke of the pen. Because such attempt would be just a mere paper law, and not by any means adapted to the real world. So, one thing is the theory, where you can state objectively that this is fundamentally the dynamics, but that occur into war, into the duel, between these two combatants. But in reality, the use of violence is always tied fundamentally by other factors that control it and modify it. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, even supposing this extreme tension of forces was an absolute, so even given it for granted, which, assuming it is so, which could easily be ascertained, so even if, this absolute tension of forces could be fundamentally accepted as possible, still we must admit that the human mind would hardly submit itself to this kind of logical chimera. This is also very important. We have seen, even, I don't remember which paragraph was it, one of the first ones, when one of the previous ones, where he was talking about the fundamentally that if governments were only deciding based on a pure act of reason, there wouldn't even be a need of an actual use of violence, because at that point everything would be calculated like an algebraic function, and therefore every government would follow fundamentally and would obey to the stronger, and this one would somewhat just follow, and there would be no fight, because everything would be predetermined, initially speaking. In that case, von Clausewitz was talking about how the feelings of enmity actually intervene, also not just in the government, but also stressing the importance of the people. Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. This is much more intellectually meant instead, because it says that such extremes would be difficult to achieve even for the human mind. So how could you, in a war, basically obtain even conceive to obtain fundamentally the utmost use of force, for instance? And why would you have to do it? And here the point is that here von Clausewitz is saying not only there is no reason in reality to reason like that, because there are certain contingent factors that at the end of the day always bring you to the to essentially not reasoning in that fashion, by limiting fundamentally violence to and subjecting it to your political goals fundamentally. But von Clausewitz stresses here it would hard even for the mind to get there. So to get to the point of how to achieve it, how to conceive it, how to practically, sort everything up to reach that absolute extreme. So this is also a very brilliant remark, because it says it's not only impossible in reality to have such an extreme tension of forces between the two fighters, but basically human mind would not even be able to conceive it. Then he goes on and says there would be in many cases an unnecessary waste of power, which would be in opposition to other principles of statecraft. So this is obviously the limit. Using the utmost use of force would be kind of, if you would be just making politics curbing to the aims of war, to the ends of war, and it doesn't make sense. You don't make war for the sake of it. You make war because you need to use violence at that point in order to achieve something. So it would be stupid to say, okay, let's do war just to destroy the enemy, just to annihilate the enemy, if we don't have any other goal to do it. I mean, of course in war you can arrive to the idea you want to annihilate the enemy. But the point is that it never gets achieved in actual fact. Not because you can't throw, a nuclear weapon over a country and making it and turning it into ashes, but because you must have a reason for doing it. And this reason is practically never on the ground of saying, that's really what I want, cent for cent, and nothing else. There must be some factor, some idea that plays with so many other elements. And the principles of statecraft that von Clausewitz is talking about are pretty much evident. So they are the various reasons that bring two states to go to war with each other, but not necessarily just to pursue just the object of war by itself. It's always a political end, fundamentally, war is used for. So, and he says, in this case, an effort of will would be required disproportioned to the proposed object, which therefore it would be impossible to realize, for the human will does not derive its impulse from logical subtleties. So here the effort of will, as we've seen, is really put into play. Von Clausewitz says that there would never be fundamentally a state whose effort of will would be coincident with the extreme tension of forces. Nobody wants. I mean, it's as if, let's make it simple, because sometimes we look at war in such a destructive fashion. They say, okay, well, humans are capable literally of annihilating each other for no valid reason. But this is, in fact, a chimera. It's not really true. Humans never reason in that fashion. Just imagine that you want to fight against another individual. You need a quite a hell of a effort of will just for thinking to aggress that person, which happens usually for quite extraordinary circumstances that justify even the physical aggression. So if you were to annihilate with your own strength another person, just for the sake of putting that duel to an end, you would basically, I don't know, not necessarily you would kill yourself, but you would practically have to go beyond even your biological limits, because when you fight against someone, you're automatically put into a situation in which you really are not thinking about giving literally all the full force out, the full possible force out. You think, let's try to take this guy down, possibly with the least effort, and trying to figure out things first. So you're actually kind of reducing this for many reasons. First of all, because you have some physical limits yourself, and not just in absolute terms, but even contingental reasons. Secondly, you really need a hell of a good reason for wanting to physically annihilate one person for real. And even when we think that this is possible, we actually make an ideological point, an emotional assessment, like saying, I would like to kill, I don't know, the worst criminal on earth. But even in that case, if you had him in front of you, you would probably kill. I would probably kill him. I don't know. But in fact, I say I don't know, because I could. But there would be so many things within me that maybe even in front of the worst criminal of the world, it would make me not use my extreme tension of force in order to achieve it in some way or another. Because my effort of will is still somehow minding other elements of my, even of my future life that may be affected by this. I'm not really saying even at an emotional level, but even at a physical level. So I know it's a bit abstract, but this is exactly what von Clausewitz is talking to you about. He's telling you fundamentally that the extreme tension of forces is non-existent in reality, is an absolute, and as such is not achievable. You can make this parallelism also with maths fundamentally. It's like when in nature you look at asymptotes, I mean in a mathematical function, so you know that you can tend towards the infinite, but you can't fundamentally reach the infinite. Well, this is the point that von Clausewitz is making. This absolute is never quite reached. You can go very close to it, indeed you can, but just think about the destructiveness of, World War II, how certain countries wanted literally to wipe out others from the face of the earth, but still, that is limited. And it is even more, it's all the more limited the more, society is complex, because naturally not everybody wants, to kill, to literally make this extreme tension of force. But it's here von Clausewitz is making the example of the force of will that this would require. But even there, and probably also more importantly, even if you had such an effort of will, not necessarily you would be able to maximize biologically, fundamentally, your extreme, to maximize your tension of forces, fundamentally, because that would still be somewhat physically inconclusive, because it wouldn't reach the absolute proper. Absolutes, I think, in nature, in this sense, do not exist. Even the systems we measure are not really absolute. There is always some kind of approximation in everything we observe, and that's why also the scientifical parallelism is so important, because it's like with physical laws. You have a law of physics, which is not a rule, it's a law. It's really how things work. Let's take gravity. It has that given acceleration, but the body that it gets accelerated, even in there are so many absolute aspects into reality, into physics. For instance, the concept of vacuum. We don't know physically any real vacuum, fundamentally, as it's given by definition, as we don't have any evidence of a point or a straight line or a infinite surface. Those are all absolutes that fundamentally in nature do not exist, but towards which nature kind of tends. So war is a bit like this. You always have this kind of theory for which you have this general aim, but this is always the result, the actual material result is always approximated, because the way it turns out is always influenced by some other factor, and this is all the more evident, especially on big systems, where there is by definition more chaos fundamentally internally, and the bigger the system is fundamentally, and the less stable it is. Now, I'm not really sure I said something physically sensed, because you can have a big system that is still kind of equilibrated more than another one, but that's really the point. I mean, there are certain characteristics, certain factors that influence under this point of view, and that fundamentally bring this result. This result that that is the one of the real world, that can really be fully adherent to the absolute that we have traced. Okay, so it's interesting how also von Clausewitz here calls the subtleties fundamentally of a concept that are subtle, not because they are kind of difficult or to imagine and so on, but they're kind of useless at one point to conceive in reality, or at least they're so much influenced by many factors that they pass kind of in a secondary plan, but not because they're secondary in theory. In theory, they're always there. They're pretty absolute, but simply they find a different application into reality. It's wrong. They find a different, because they're not really applied. I mean, they're applied, but they have a different outcome, fundamentally. That is never never fully correspond to that absolute. They're more like a consequence. It's as if there was a metaphysical and physical world at that point. I know it's bad parallelism, but it's really the point. It's as if you imagine that there is something that can never be changed by definition, which is not real. It doesn't belong to the physical world in this sense. And then there is a physical world that reflects it, but is never quite as perfect as the absolute, by definition. By physical laws, actually. And in fact, von Clausewitz says exactly this, but everything takes a different shape when we pass from abstractions to reality. That's it. In the former, so in the abstraction, everything must be subject to optimism, and we must imagine the one side as well as the other striving after perfection and even attaining it. This is important because here von Clausewitz makes the example of an abstraction that therefore you can follow by saying, okay, I know this abstraction, so it has to work like that. This is a bit how positivism worked in the 19th century eventually. I mean, this idea that there are certain positive, in fact, actions that through which you can legitimately achieve that result. As we will see instead, the Clausewitzian theory stems from the concept that fundamentally everything really goes wrong. And it doesn't go wrong because von Clausewitz is a pessimist, but or an anti-optimist, but only because he is a realist, and he knows that in spite, the abstraction does exist, and theoretically you should follow it, there are so many other contingent factors that bring you to this not to happen, and therefore you have to take it into account before they happen, so that you have to concentrate paradoxically more on the outcomes of these consequences than to the abstract in itself, which is something that, by the way, you can always tend towards too. I mean, it's as we have seen in those previous paragraphs, this reciprocal actions, these fundamental principles are always there, not because someone decides to apply to them or not, but because war actually works in this way. It's as if the mover would bring you to do something like that, and then you are you're acquainted with lots of difficulties that, in this sense, make you still move on the base of that theory, but oblige you to deal also with practice. So, also testing your limits fundamentally, and realizing that you can't fully achieve that absolute. So von Clausewitz here is saying fundamentally, let's imagine that there was such a thing in reality. Or better, let's assume that we could really follow a war that, being a war that really corresponds to this reality. So how would this war be? So in this situation, as you understand, the both sides would strive after perfection, and even fundamentally pretending to attain it. So von Clausewitz says, how could this happen in reality? I mean, which would be the conditions in reality to meet these absolutes? Because reality does tend towards the absolute. It's like the asymptote, in a function. So von Clausewitz here is eventually, in the following paragraph that we will read, we will get fundamentally to the overturning of these principles, because von Clausewitz says, okay, this is what would happen if this absolute worked really in reality. Hence, whatever it is, it doesn't happen in reality, and we have to use it as a law fundamentally in our own world. So he draws these characteristics. Will this ever take place in reality? If it will, it will if, says, first, war becomes a completely isolated act which arises suddenly and is in no way connected with the previous history of the combatant states. So if you're acquainted with Clausewitzian theory, you know, as we will read in the following paragraph, that war is never an isolated act. So this is how also von Clausewitz uses this, logics, and makes a kind of a demonstration by absurdity, like in this case. So war, the first characteristic, the first condition under which such a conflict would take place into reality, such an attainment would take place into reality, is that war becomes a completely isolated act, which arises suddenly and is in no way connected with the previous history of the combatant states. As you understand, this is not possible. Here, the idea of war as a completely isolated act means, in Clausewitzian theories, if war was completely undetached from any kind of political action. So it's as if war had a domain that is completely uncontaminated in this abstract condition. And therefore it obeys only to its own internal laws, the ones that we have traced in the previous paragraphs, and that gave rise to these three reciprocal actions: the utmost use of force, this constant interaction that exists exclusively by the collision of the clashes between the two forces, that turns out into just a collision of a shock of the strengths of the two fighters. So this type of war, of ideal war, would have to arise suddenly, so meaning that it was not originated by anything, which is also an absurdity, because war always arises from something. It's not something that pops out for no reason. There must be very good reasons. It has to be enacted as an act of violence. And then says and is not in no way connected with the previous history of the combatant states. So it's as if these combatant states at a certain point began to fight against each other for no reason, and especially without any barrier. So without any form of attrition of reality. It's an absurdity. It's a purely aphysical ideal, and it doesn't make sense. Other condition under which such conflict would occur is this to be limited to a single solution, or to several simultaneous solutions. So fundamentally here, I believe it means that under such conditions, war would have to be dictated by a single reason, or at least a sum of reasons that are simultaneously acting all together towards the same direction of this clash. So and that this would fundamentally end in itself. The third condition is to contain within itself the solution perfect and complete, free from any reaction upon it through a calculation beforehand of the political situation which will follow from it. So this is also the other fundamental abstraction that we have seen once again in the example about the algebraic relations between governments which fundamentally interact with each other, already knowing in advance fundamentally who would win and who would lose. fundamentally. So here it's saying exactly the same thing. It's as if this war had to have a solution that is so perfect and complete that is not altered by any other factor during the duel, and that basically already knows beforehand. So in anticipation of it, which result would follow fundamentally, if I understood correctly. So it's also completely abstract. So von Clausewitz here, once again, we repeat it, is making a demonstration by absurd, and is going to overturn it in the next paragraph. So this is quite important, because through this paragraph von Clausewitz shows us the absurdity of a war, or of a real war, that would follow such principles. In fact, in reality, of a war that would follow the drone principles in reality. So no war fundamentally has this perfectly military dimension. It always goes with some interference within it. You always have some previous reason for fighting it that starts, by the way, by not knowing what the outcome of war will be. This is particularly interesting because it makes you understand that everything can really go wrong, because there are so many factors that intervene into the military sphere, even from what is not military. And here we can observe it, obviously, at any psychophysical level. There's literally everything that can interfere with war, that can make it change. So, and then that basically every war has also has a kind of unexpected outcome, fundamentally. And these are all things that you should know in advance. So you realize this is very important, because von Clausewitz bases his theory on these concepts fundamentally, and that's how he grounds his thought. This is perhaps now we will see how the following paragraphs are fundamentally all the overturn of these principles, because the 7th is: war is never an isolated act. War does not consist of a single instantaneous blow. And 9th, result in war is never absolute. And so it's every paragraph now is dedicated respectively to the, it seems to me now, as the confutation of these three conditions respectively. And we will get into that another time. Sorry if today I didn't express myself in a probably quite a clear fashion, but I don't know how it sounded. I also didn't make many examples, because this paragraph is devoid of examples. It's pure theory, we can say. It's purely logical. It doesn't make examples. So even in here, von Clausewitz is making you can understand von Clausewitz is making a fundamental point, because it's as if it was really a mathematical calculation, whereas in other paragraphs, as we have seen, war is kind of you can draw many parallelisms also with practice when you discuss theory. Okay, so in next chapter we'll go on under that other point of view. So I don't think we have anything else to say. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed my video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.